All right, so you ready for this? We've got this KPMG report you sent us, the tariff landscape under the new Trump administration.
Yeah.
And wow, this thing is pretty intense. We're going to be talking about tariffs, trade wars, and what all of this could mean for businesses.
It definitely looks like things are going to change now that Trump is back in the White House.
Yeah.
I think this report is a pretty good indication that we are going to see some major changes coming from the administration, especially when it comes to trade with countries like China.
Okay, so let's back up for a second and make sure everybody listening is on the same page. Could you just give us a quick, Tariff 101? What are they and how do they work?
Sure. So imagine you're importing electronics from overseas. Tariffs are basically taxes that the government adds on to the price of those goods as they're coming into the country.
Okay.
It's kind of like a toll booth for international trade.
That makes sense. And then to keep all of this organized, there's this thing called the harmonized tariff schedule.
Yeah.
Right. It sounds a
Wow.
little complicated.
It is a little bit, but think of it like a giant catalog of products. Every item that you can think of is categorized in this, and each one is given its own tariff rate. So whether you're talking about a smartphone or a shipment of steel, the HTS determines how much you're going to have to pay.
Okay. So how does all of this tie into Trump's trade agenda for his new term? What is he planning to do with tariffs?
Well, the report makes it pretty clear that Trump is really focused on using tariffs to get what he wants, particularly when it comes to China.
Okay.
We're very likely to see some pretty significant increases on Chinese goods, maybe even as much as a 10% jump on top of what's already in place. And it's not just China. The report also mentions that countries that do a lot of trade with China could also be impacted.
Wow. So 10% on top of what's already there. That's pretty serious. What about other types of tariffs? The report mentioned that there are a few different kinds, right?
Yeah, definitely. So there are things like Section 232 tariffs, which are specifically designed to protect national security. You might remember that we already have those in place for steel and aluminum.
Oh, right. Yeah, those were all over the news a few years ago.
Yeah. Then you've got Section 201 tariffs. Those are used when there are unfair trade practices happening.
Okay.
It's a way for the government to step in and try to level the playing field if, say, another country is dumping really cheap products into the U.S. market.
And then there's something called the de minimis threshold.
Yeah.
Which sounds like it's a pretty big deal for small businesses.
Oh, yeah, definitely. So right now, if you import something that's worth less than $800, you actually don't have to pay any tariffs at all. But this report suggests that Trump might try to lower that threshold, which would mean businesses would have to pay tariffs on smaller shipments, too.
So imagine you're a small business owner. You're selling handmade goods online. And suddenly that shipment of beads that you're getting from overseas, which used to be duty-free, now comes with a pretty hefty tax bill.
Exactly.
Okay.
It could have a pretty big impact on a lot of those smaller businesses.
Yeah, definitely. So which countries should be worried? I know the report talked about some being more vulnerable than others.
Yeah. Definitely, China is right at the top of the list. Trump has been pretty vocal about this whole idea of decoupling from China economically, so we can expect to see a pretty wide range of tariffs imposed on a lot of different Chinese goods.
What about closer to home? What about Mexico and Canada?
Yeah.
Are they in the hot seat too?
Mexico is definitely facing some serious risk. Do you remember those threats to put a 25% tariff on all Mexican goods? Well, that's still something that could very well happen, especially with all of the negotiations going on around border security and with the USMCA.
Right. And what about Canada?
Yeah, they could be looking at a similar 25% tariff tied to border security, and the USMCA renegotiations are also a potential problem for them. It's definitely a tense situation.
So it sounds like nobody is really safe from these tariffs.
Yeah.
What about the European Union? They've had some pretty public trade disagreements with the U.S. in the past.
Yeah, you're right. And this report suggests that those tensions could definitely flare up again. Remember the Boeing Airbus tariffs that got put on hold during the Biden administration? Well, those could be back on the table.
And wouldn't that almost certainly trigger retaliatory tariffs from the EU? I mean, it really sounds like we could be on the verge of a global trade war.
The risk is definitely there. If the U.S. really digs in its heels, other countries are probably going to respond by doing the same thing. And then you get this tit-for-tat escalation, which is really bad news for everyone.
This is all starting to feel a little overwhelming. But I know that the report also talked about ways that businesses can actually prepare for all of this.
Yeah, definitely. There are definitely things that businesses can do to mitigate the potential impact of these tariffs. It's all about being proactive and strategic.
Well, let's get into it. I know I'm really curious to hear about these strategies, and I'm sure our listeners are too.
Okay, let's start with the most important thing. Staying informed. Global regulatory monitoring is absolutely critical in this kind of environment where things are changing all the time. Businesses need to know what's happening with trade policy around the world so they can anticipate changes and make adjustments as needed. Trade intelligence is going to be more valuable than ever. So that means things like subscribing to industry newsletters, attending conferences, maybe even hiring a trade consultant.
Okay, so things like that.
Yeah, it's all about knowing what's coming down the pipeline so you're not caught off guard.
Got it. What about data analysis? I know the report mentioned something about really understanding your trade data.
Yeah, that's really important. This is where things get down to the nitty-gritty. Businesses need to be looking closely at their own data to figure out which products are most likely to be hit by tariffs. And then they need to start thinking about the potential financial impact and what they can do to minimize it.
So, like, imagine I'm a furniture company and I import wood from Canada. What kind of data am I looking at?
Okay, so you'd want to look at your current tariff rates, the volume of wood you're importing, and your total cost. And then you use that data to play out different scenarios. What happens if tariffs go up by 5%, 10%, 25%?
Right, so that's where those, like, what-if spreadsheets come in.
Exactly. By playing out different scenarios like that, you can start to see which products are most vulnerable. And then you can start brainstorming ways to mitigate that risk. Maybe you start looking for wood from other sources, or you renegotiate your contracts to include some kind of price protection.
Yeah, that makes sense. And speaking of contracts, the report also mentioned that renegotiating those contracts can be really important in this kind of environment.
Absolutely. It's all about having those safeguards in place. Let's say you're a clothing company and you're importing fabric from China. You want to make sure that your contracts with those suppliers include provisions that allow for price adjustments if those tariffs suddenly go up.
Right, so that way you're not locked into a price that could put you out of business. That's smart.
Yeah, it's about thinking ahead and protecting yourself.
So we talked about staying informed, analyzing data, renegotiating contracts. The report also mentioned this idea of trade transformation, which sounds a little more complicated.
Yeah, trade transformation is basically a top-to-bottom review of your entire trade compliance process. You're looking for any weak spots and making sure that your strategies can actually weather the storm.
So are we talking about hiring a whole team of trade compliance experts?
For bigger companies with more complex supply chains, that might be a good idea. But for others, it might just mean making sure that you and your team are up to speed on the latest regulations. Maybe you need to invest in some new technology that can help you streamline things. It's all about finding ways to improve your strategy.
Okay, so we've got stay informed, analyze your data, renegotiate your contracts, and transform your trade compliance process. That's quite a list.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that businesses can do to get ready for these potential tariff changes?
Yeah, there's one more big one. Supply chain diversification. This is all about taking a look at where you're getting your products from and considering whether it might make sense to find some alternative suppliers, maybe in countries that aren't facing such high tariff.
Don't put all your eggs in one basket.
Exactly. If all of your suppliers are in one country and that country suddenly gets hit with a bunch of new tariffs, that's a big problem. But if you've got suppliers in multiple countries, you've got more flexibility.
So like if I'm that furniture company we talked about before, instead of getting all of my wood from Canada, maybe I start looking at places like Mexico or Brazil.
Exactly. It's about spreading out your risk and creating a more resilient supply chain.
These are some really good strategies. But what happens if those tariffs do actually hit? Is it game over?
Not at all. There are actually a lot of things that businesses can do to potentially recover some of those costs or even reduce them. It's like having a whole secret arsenal of weapons.
Okay, I'm listening. Spill the beans.
One of those secret weapons that a lot of people don't know about is something called the first sale for export principle.
Okay, first sale for export. That definitely sounds like a secret weapon.
Basically, it's about using the original sale price of the goods for customs valuation, rather than the final price that you paid.
Okay, so let me see if I understand this. Let's say I'm importing electronics from China, and the manufacturer in China sells those electronics to a trading company for $100.
Yeah.
And then I buy them from that trading company for $150.
Right.
So normally I'd be paying tariffs on that $150 price. But under the first sale for export rule, I could argue that I should only be paying tariffs on that original $100 price.
Exactly.
That could be a big difference. I'm guessing there's some fine print involved, though.
Yeah, you do have to be able to prove that original sale price. And you have to show that the transaction between the manufacturer and the trading company was a legitimate sale. It's not always easy, but it's definitely something to look into.
Okay. What about tariff engineering? That sounds almost too good to be true.
It can be a really powerful tool, but it does require a pretty deep understanding of the harmonized tariff schedule, and you need to be really strategic about it.
So how does it work? Do you like magically transform the products into something else?
Not magic, but you do need to be a little creative. It's about finding ways to modify your products or even their packaging so that they qualify for a lower tariff rate.
So going back to that furniture company, could they maybe modify their wood products somehow to get a lower tariff rate?
It's possible. Let's say they're importing unfinished chairs. They might be able to classify those chairs under a different tariff code if they add a simple code of paint or stain before shipping them.
So a little bit of work could save them a lot of money.
Exactly.
That's pretty clever.
It is. But you have to be really careful with this. Tariff engineering has to be done legally and ethically. You can't just make some random changes and hope for the best. You need to make sure that the modifications you're making are actually legitimate and that you're not trying to trick customs officials.
Right. You don't want to get in trouble.
No, definitely not. It's always a good idea to talk to an expert to make sure you're doing things the right way.
Okay, so we've got first sale for export and tariff engineering. What other options are there?
There's valuation, which is all about making sure that you're only being charged tariffs on things that are actually dutiable.
So, like, I shouldn't have to pay tariffs on things like the cost of insurance or transportation.
Exactly. Those things can really add up, so it's important to make sure they're not being included in your customs valuation.
Got it. And then there's duty drawback, which sounds pretty good.
It is duty drawback lets companies get refunds for the tariffs they paid on goods that are later exported.
So if I import electronic components from China, and then I assemble those components into finished products here in the U.S., and then I export those finished products to Europe, I can get a refund for the tariffs I originally paid on the components.
That's right.
It's like a tariff rebate.
You could say that.
I bet there's a lot of paperwork involved, though.
Yeah, there is. You need to keep really good records to prove that the imported goods were actually used in the products that you exported.
Okay, noted. What about country of origin analysis? How does that factor into all of this?
With all of these potential changes happening with tariffs and trade agreements, it's more important than ever to really understand where your products are coming from and how that impacts your tariff obligations.
So it's not just about where the finished product is assembled.
Right. You need to look at the entire supply chain and figure out where all of the value is being added.
So if I'm importing electronics from China, but some of the components are actually manufactured in Vietnam, that could affect how much I have to pay in tariffs.
Exactly. And the USMCA is still pretty new, so there might be some changes coming in terms of how country of origin is determined. It's something that businesses need to keep an eye on.
Okay. And speaking of the USMCA, what about free trade agreements in general? It seems like using those agreements would be a pretty straightforward way to avoid tariffs.
They can be, but you have to make sure you're doing everything by the book. You can only use free trade agreements if you're sourcing from countries that actually have those agreements with the U.S. And you need to make sure you've got all the right documentation.
So it's not just about finding the cheapest supplier. You need to find a supplier that meets all of the requirements for the free trade agreement.
Exactly. And customs officials are getting really strict about enforcing these rules. They're cracking down on any kind of fraud, so you need to make sure you're doing everything right.
Okay, good to know. What about foreign trade zones? I've heard about those, but they sound a little mysterious.
So a foreign trade zone is basically a designated area within the U.S. that's considered to be outside of U.S. customs territory.
So it's like a little tariff-free bubble inside the U.S.
You could think of it that way. You can import goods into a foreign trade zone, and you can store them there, you can manipulate them, you can even manufacture products in there, and you don't have to pay any duties until those goods are actually shipped into the U.S. market.
So if I'm importing those electronic components from China, I can bring them into a foreign trade zone, assemble them into finished products, and then I only have to pay tariffs when I sell those finished products in the U.S.
Exactly. It can be a great way to save money.
Wow, that sounds pretty amazing. What's the catch?
Well, setting up shop in a foreign trade zone can be pretty complicated and expensive. It's not the right solution for every business.
Okay, that makes sense. And finally, there's duty reconciliation. What's that all about?
Duty reconciliation is basically a post-importation audit. You go back and compare the values that you declared for your imports to the actual costs.
So, like, if I realize that I accidentally overpaid on my tariffs, I can file for a refund.
Exactly. It's all about making sure you're paying the correct amount.
Okay, well, we have covered a lot of ground here. It's clear that tariffs are really complicated, but I think you've given us some great information about how businesses can prepare for potential changes and maybe even reduce the impact of those tariffs.
Yeah, I think it's all about giving businesses the tools they need to make smart decisions.
Absolutely. And before we wrap up, I do want to touch on something that I think sometimes gets lost in these discussions, and that's the human impact of tariffs.
Yeah, that's a really important point. It's easy to get caught up in all the numbers and the economics, but we have to remember that these policies actually affect real people's lives.
We talk about trade wars and the economic impact, but, it's people whose lives are actually being affected by these decisions.
Right, and tariffs can mean higher prices for things that people need, which
Yes.
means they have less money to spend on other things. And tariffs can also lead to job losses,
Right.
especially in industries that depend on imports and exports.
Yeah, it's a ripple effect. It impacts the entire economy.
Exactly. And we can't forget about the disruption to global supply chains. When tariffs are introduced or increased, things get really complicated. It can lead to delays and shortages, and that just drives costs up even more.
It's a good reminder that trade policy isn't just about numbers and regulations. It's about real people.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, we've covered a lot of ground today. We talked about the different types of tariffs, the countries that are most at risk, and some really solid strategies that businesses can use to try to get ahead of these changes and maybe even soften the blow.
We really did. We talked about global regulatory monitoring and data analysis, and some pretty advanced strategies like for sale, for export, and tariff engineering.
It's been a pretty intense journey into the world of tariffs, but I think we've given our listeners some really great information today.
I hope so.
Before we go, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought, something to think about as they process all of this.
Okay, what's that?
What if, instead of looking at tariffs as this obstacle to overcome,
Mm-hmm.
what if we looked at them as an opportunity?
Oh, that's interesting.
I like that.
I mean, think about it. Tariffs could actually force businesses to be more creative, to be more efficient, to be more strategic overall.
Like it forces them to adapt.
Exactly. The businesses that can figure out how to make this work, the ones that can find creative ways to deal with these tariffs and maybe even use them to their advantage, those are the businesses that are going to come out ahead.
It's like survival of the fittest.
Yeah.
The businesses that can evolve are the ones that are going to thrive.
So as you're navigating all of this, remember that knowledge is power. Stay informed, stay flexible, and don't be afraid to think outside the box. And remember that behind all of these numbers and policies, there are real people.
That's a great point.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into the world of tariffs. We'll be back soon with another fascinating topic. Until then, happy exploring.